Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. And now to the heart of the matter. I am privileged to introduce our celebrity speakers, Lieutenant Colonels Rosenberg and McKim, who have generously donated their time and talents for us today, and who are going to clarify for us some of the mysteries and unpublished details of life aboard what is arguably the most exotic aircraft ever built. Colonel Rosenberg and McKim, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Cindy. We'd like to thank everybody for coming out. We appreciate it, especially in this chilly, cold weather today. Thank you for joining us. And it was pointed out to me that this is the first time we have a balcony audience back there in the corner. Glad you were there. So Ed and I would like to proceed with a little different type of presentation than some of you may have seen before. I'm sure we have a lot of enthusiasts, aviation enthusiasts, and specifically other enthusiasts, and veterans are here, and we appreciate you coming out. Thank you. And also, as she mentioned, some other people that have worked in the industry. Thank you for showing up. We really appreciate that also. If you've seen any of these YouTube videos or attended any of these other presentations, the presenter usually jumps right into specific things about the airplane and so forth. We want to do something a little different, and we're just going to present the recruitment and how you get in the program and what the program entailed, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end, and we can answer all your questions about any of those specific things that you've seen before or want more information with regard to the aircraft's capabilities and performance. So this is basically what we talked about in the beginning, what we're going to talk about with regard to facts and interests about the aircraft itself.
As Marie said, usually these presentations, we can show you a lot of pictures and give you a lot of numbers. We thought we'd give you a little bit more of the human side of how we got in the program and what it took to get in the program at the time. It was a very selective program to be chosen for. They only took maybe one pilot and one RSO a year into the program, so it was a rather selective program run by Strategic Air Command, who owned the aircraft at the time, and that was most of our origins. We came up through Strategic Air Command. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that process and answer any questions you may have, and hopefully we'll show you some nice background pictures here too.
As Ed mentioned, the selection process was highly selective of who they got. It was an all-volunteer crew force. Individuals that had an interest in the program to begin with would go through a process where they would contact someone at Beale Air Force Base and then receive instructions on the process with regard to submitting their paperwork and so forth. That initial phone talk, in my case, I got in the program in 1973, fall of 1973, and Ed came in a little later. What was your date? Do you recall offhand?
When I came into the program?
Yeah,
February.
The interview?
Yeah, it was fall of
80, wasn't it?
79 was the interview,
yeah.
And then I joined in 80.
Right. So the process changed a little bit, so you'll get two perspectives here. What I was going to say was the first individual I happened to talk to at Beale Air Force Base was Colonel Ken Collins. Unbeknownst to me, there were actually two Colonel Ken Collins in the SR-71 program. So I had a long conversation. He was interested, and he told me to call him back. And when I did call back and asked for Colonel Ken Collins, I got the other Colonel Ken Collins. We got things straightened out. They were interested. I sent my paperwork off to Beale Air Force Base. How did yours start?
Mine started at the unit level. Usually you learned more about the program from some of the other crew members who might have been in your squadron that preceded you. As a navigator, I took kind of the standard route in Strategic Air Command to get to this assignment. I first flew B-52s out of March, where we spent most of the time TDY while we were in Vietnam. And then I went to FB-111s at Plattsburgh, which seemed to be an interesting criteria that they wanted us to have to be able to fly in this airplane, because it was basically a single-person pilot, single-person navigator. You were not in the same cockpit, and you were back-to-back, and you couldn't talk to the other person except on interphone. And decided you needed a little bit more what we called fast mover time, the way you thought about navigation, more so than the B-52. But that was a general route for us navigators, was through the chain in SAC of B-52s, FB-111s, and then to the SR program.
So for the pilots, it's very similar as Ed described it, and they were really interested in fighter pilots that had a single seat time, or even in F-4s, where at one point the F-4 initially in the Air Force had a pilot in the front and a pilot in the back. And as the Vietnam War heated up, they realized they needed more pilots, and they started putting navigators in the back. So when I volunteered, it happened that there was a F-4 navigator that volunteered also, not someone I knew or had been in the unit or had ever met in F-4s. And Colonel Ken Collins, the first one I talked to, thought this would be a good match. We got a front seat pilot and a back seat pilot that talked the same language from the F-4. And so they had me out for an interview. It was a 5-day or a week-long interview. We came in on a Monday and went to a 2-day physical out at Travis Air Force Base at the hospital there, a highly extensive physical. And then the third day back at Beale Air Force Base, you got a tour of the facilities, and you had a flight in a T-38, which was basically just maneuvering type of flight, doing acrobatics. And the next day, which would have been a Thursday, you had the second ride in the T-38, and it was in the back seat under a hood flying instruments. And then that afternoon, you would meet with a lot of the crew members in the squadron. And on Friday, your last day, they let you sleep in till about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and you met the wing commander or the vice commander, depending on who was doing the interviewing. For me, I was fortunate from the standpoint that I got to interview with Colonel Jerry O'Malley, who went on, attained 4 stars. Anybody that happened to know him, he was probably the next Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and unfortunately was in a tragic accident with his wife in a T-39 transport type airplane in a crash in Ohio. And they both passed away. But during the interview process, just as a sort of a interesting, somewhat humorous type thing maybe, at the very end, he was going through my personnel records, and he said, "I see you were stationed in Japan, and your officer efficiency report is endorsed by a Colonel Irby Jarvis was his name." And he said, "Did you know Colonel Jarvis?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir. He was the wing commander." And he said, "I see you were an instructor in the F-4 at the time. Did you ever fly with him?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir. I did fly with Colonel Jarvis." He said, "Maury, what kind of pilot was he?" And I felt really on the spot, and I was trying to be diplomatic. And I said, "Well, Colonel," I said, "I'm sure the wing commander has a lot more things to do or on his mind than just flying the airplane." And like yourselves, he snickered and he said, "Irby Jarvis was a student of mine in pilot training. I almost washed him out. He wasn't very good. It sounds like he hasn't changed much."
I'll tell him about the BART check. The BART check. One of the other processes, as Maury was describing there about trying to get selected for the program, there was the official side, which was a curriculum that they put the pilots and the navigators through to check out your flying skills. Hopefully you were already an accomplished aviator by the time you got selected to come to the program, and they weren't going to teach you basic flying and navigation. So after that, it was your ability to learn systems and function at Mach 3, which is about 33 miles a minute, which is pretty challenging. We always used to have a saying that you'd never been lost till you've been lost at Mach 3, and it's pretty humbling, I have to tell you. One of the other processes during that interview process was what we called the bar check. And it was usually the last event, and the applicants really didn't understand that it might have been the most important part, because after a week of flying and simulator time, you got to go to the bar and meet the rest of the guys in the squadron who you may not have interfaced with yet. But that opportunity was a socialization to see if the rest of us thought we'd get along with you, because my first year I had 285 days TDY. So you weren't home a lot. You lived TDY either at Milton Hall or at Kadena. So if guys let down their guard a little bit in the bar and maybe imbibed a little too much and got to talking too much, that was part of the selection criteria, whether they knew it or not. And it was also a very telltale part of who they were as a person. So it was an important part of the interview.
So the ground training in the simulator, we started off with about a month, I believe it was, of systems knowledge with crew chief, or maybe even a Lockheed tech rep, and they would just go through all the systems in the aircraft. And it was, from our standpoint, not only differences from other things we're used to, but it was somewhat technical to a degree from the standpoint the mechanics that worked on this airplane, like the crew members that flew it, just were so in love with the airplane once they became a part of it, that their knowledge was vast with regard to the specifics that they did, and the enthusiasm they had for the systems that they took care of. Once you finished that in-depth process, then you went through ground training in the simulator, and part of the simulator was you trained with another crew that would tell you from the standpoint of the pilot or the navigator, you know, here's what you have in the airplane, this is what you can control, this is what you can do, and here's the checklists. And they would go through the checklist, which Ed will talk about a little bit. It's highly extensive, and the backseater became the worker bee, so to speak, because part of the training was learning to communicate with each other. And when the pilot's flying the airplane, and if there's a problem or an emergency, he has to describe it to the navigator, who's going to go into the checklist to make sure that they cover all the items that are in the checklist. With the slide there that you can see, the cockpit, the simulator, the bottom left there is the front seat, and the one on the right is the back seat for the navigator. It had some motion, but it wasn't as sophisticated as the simulators that we have at this time, with visibility, full pictures, quite a bit of actual motion and so forth.
This was an interesting concept. This was obviously a very early age simulator. It was made by the Link company out of Binghamton, New York at that time. And as Maury mentioned, the crew members here were physically separated. We didn't sit one behind each other. In fact, the IP for instructing the pilot sat on the motion base directly behind the pilot in the cockpit, so he could look around the ejection seat and actually see what the pilot was doing. Us backseaters were relegated over here. It was kind of a slide-in coffin kind of thing, and you couldn't really look in there. But one of the things that I had to learn and had to adapt to as forming as a good crew was you had to handle most of the pacing of what was going on with the airplane, whether you were under emergency procedures or normal procedures. And as all of you other fellow aviators know out there, the one thing that's tantamount about flying the airplane is staying ahead of the airplane, either in the way you're thinking or what's coming up or what you're going to be doing. So we had a checklist that was about that thick. Of course, being a good Strategic Air Command aviators, you had to have a lot of procedures. So it was a very in-depth checklist. And usually the navigator would read the checklist and the procedure, and the pilot would echo back the response, and then you would go through something like that for either normal procedures, like take off and climb out, or if we were having emergency procedures. The other thing that was challenging for a lot of people, and you guys may have realized it as well, going to the simulator took the right attitude. And what I mean by that was, first off, it was not going to work right. They gave you a lot of malfunctions. And they give you malfunctions on malfunctions to see if you could sort things out in a certain priority. And that was very challenging because you would do something and then they'd reset it and you could kind of start over to enhance the learning procedures. So later on, Maury and I were evaluator of pilots and navigators, and one of the worst things you could do to a guy in a simulator if you were giving him a check ride was not give him any malfunctions. They start making stuff up, you know. They're going like, what am I missing? What have I overlooked? You know, so just letting you fly the airplane as a simulator like a real airplane was always kind of a privilege, but as I said, the simulator never seemed to work. You were always dealing with malfunctions, which was part of the learning curve.
What Ed has alluded to is it was extremely intense and could be very exhaustive, actually, at the end of a simulator period. We would usually have about an hour or more going over what we were going to do in the simulator and talking about the checklist and some of the procedures. And then once we got in the simulator, we would start, as he said, getting some of those malfunctions, and then depending on the progress, malfunction on top of malfunction. And when you came out of there, it was almost as if you had flown an airplane on a hot day. You were sweaty and tired.
So it's kind of like that scene in Apollo 13 where they said, you know, let's do it over again. That was the way it was. And this device was such a critical part of your training that you had to do well in this device to proceed in the training program. And so you had to approach it with a very serious attitude about what you were trying to learn in there.
So now we're going to talk about the first flight for the pilot and then for the RSO. With regard to the first flight, you had gotten through two somewhat critical phases, the first phase being the interview process, the physical and the interview process. The second phase, progressing to a point in the simulator. We still were going to continue with simulator rides even after the first flight in the aircraft. And you'd gotten through that part with regard to showing your capabilities, and now you're ready for your first ride. For some individuals, it was somewhat anticlimactic for the pilot in the fact that you did not go supersonic, but you were just getting used to being in a pressure suit, actually flying the aircraft, taking off, landing, shooting some touch-and-go landings. You flew out to a tanker, and then you did air refueling. And surprisingly, this was a phase where they would get some of the latter washouts in the program for some pilots that had not done much air refueling, or for some reason the air refueling in this aircraft was just different than other aircraft. I flew F4s and we did air refueling, and you could visually, just like fly formation in a fighter, you didn't have to really concentrate or worry about anything other than just keeping your position in a visual picture like this. I'm just going to stay right here. Well, the visual picture wasn't the same because the cockpit in the front seat, their canopy is not open above your head. It's a solid. So you can't be looking up at the other airplane to fly formation. You're either looking out at the sides, which is not that good, especially when the weather's bad or there's turbulence. So it forced you to look through the front screen at these lights underneath the refueling aircraft on the belly of the aircraft that were like a stoplight in a sense. There were red, yellow, and green. So you wanted to be in the green all the time. And this was a phase where we would also refuel, learn to refuel single engine with an afterburner, with or without an afterburner, where you'd pull one throttle to idle and try to refuel because you might be in that situation. And it was more difficult than a lot of the guys realized. So that surprisingly to a lot of people was a washout phase for pilots.
Since Maury brought it up, he didn't know I'm going to tell this story, but I'll tell it on him anyway. While we were crewed together, they were bringing the KC-10 into the inventory. Up to that time, all the air refueling had been done by the KC-135s. So we were selected to do part of the operational test, the final part of the refueling with the KC-10. So we flew a T-38 down to March, and we met with the the crew who was going to fly the next day against us to pass gas. And the one thing that the part of the instruction from the boomer, who is now, he's forward, he's not in the pod like the old day was. Right. He's forward in the aircraft, and he's doing this by a monitor. So he told Maury, he said, now one of the things you'll probably hear from me as you get in to pre-contact was that you're too far aft because it's a big airplane. Maury said, yeah, okay. So he said, I'm not going to do that. So the next day we went out to fly, and we made the rendezvous with the tanker, and I remember one of the first things as we closed on the tanker, Maury said, damn, that's a big airplane. And it was, compared to what we were used to. So we pulled up into what he thought was pre-contact, and we sat there and sat there. He finally came on the interphone and said, forward 5. Yeah. Maury said, damn, I wasn't going to do that. Anyway, it was just the visual picture for him that was so different than the size of that airplane under a KC-135 versus a KC-10.
So the pilot would get 5 rides in the trainer. The first one, as I mentioned, was subsonic, and then the next 4 you flew supersonic. And the very first flight, you only went up to Mach 2.8. It doesn't sound like much difference between 2.8 and 3.0, but there's actually a big difference in the aircraft performance and how it handles and everything. From a maintenance standpoint, as I recall, above 2.8 was hot time. Where did Gene go? Right. So that meant different checks and services that the crew chiefs had to do for the maintenance side of the airplane. So there was quite a difference in that 0.2 of a Mach number. So the first flight for me, as I mentioned, was subsonic and anticlimactic, and then we progressed through the next 4 flights before I got to fly with the RSO. The first time, I was in the program twice. The first time I went through, I know the RSO only got 1 ride, I thought, in the A model before we flew together. Was it the same when you and I did it? I don't remember.
I believe so.
Yeah, it was just 1. So Ed can tell you a little bit about his first flight.
Before I tell you a little bit about this, there's somebody here I'd like to acknowledge. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Beth, SR-71 pilot. Say hello, Jack. So the first time the RSO gets to fly in the SR platform, other than the simulator, he's flying with an operationally qualified pilot, and you get to go Mach 3 on your first flight. So what you're doing at that time is still the continuation of the training program and actually getting to see the airplane, as we called it, work in flight with hopefully not very many malfunctions like you had in the simulator. So it's always an exhilarating time, and it was the first time I was in 111s and we went supersonic there, but we certainly didn't go Mach 3. So you're flying with a qualified pilot. One of the first things you're working on is making the rendezvous with the KC-135 or the KC-10 refueling aircraft. We accomplished that with a differential ranging device and with the RF direction finder. On the tanker, we both had a instrument that would synchronize, and we had pointers in the aircraft that would tell you distance and DME to the tanker. The aircraft has a radar, but it's not a conventional radar, which means we couldn't do weather detection or ground mapping or even air-to-air detection. It was a synthetic aperture radar, which is a radar of really high resolution and meant for looking at terrain on either side of the aircraft. So you were dependent on the instrumentation to get the rendezvous with the tanker before the pilot could pick him up visually. And Maury flew with Chuck Yeager. And when Yeager flew with him, part of Yeager's claim to fame had always been that he had great eyesight. And Maury could actually confirm that he saw the tanker way out there.
He did. I was impressed.
Yeah.
You know, he probably saw the tanker at 30 plus miles.
So then after your the refueling, usually standard procedure, you would take off with a lighter weight fuel load. You'd go out, conduct the rendezvous, and unload gas. And then go and do a hot leg, as we used to call it, where you'd climb to altitude and speed of Mach 3.
So once you started the training to be qualified and be able to go on operational sorties, they had you accumulate 100 hours in the airplane. It was actually closer to 75 for the backseater, wasn't it? 75, 80 hours because of the difference in the flights, that the pilot got more training flights than the navigator. I don't think any first operational deployments went to Mildenhall, did they? They all went to Kadena.
All to Kadena.
Yeah. Your first flights went to Okinawa, Japan, to Kadena Air Base.
And I think part of that was we flew a lot of night sorties out of Mildenhall.
Yeah.
And they wanted time built up at Kadena.
Correct. So that was your first deployment, and we normally would go there on a KC-135Q model, one of the tankers that we refueled on. We would fly over with other crew members. It would usually be on a swap out where there were maintenance personnel would be swapping, and also some of the mission planners and the crew members would be swapping, swap out of crew members also. So that was your first trip over, and it normally was a 6-week deployment to Japan and then back to Beale after that. When you first got to Kadena for your first deployment, then there was a lot of orientation with regard to procedures and rules of engagement and so forth before you actually flew your first flight. I don't recall if we actually got a hop around the island.
We didn't do a hot flight.
No, we just went right on an operational sortie, right?
We did.
Yeah.
So one of the first things you did when you got to Kadena as the new crew, you were still kind of in training and you were still being evaluated, if you will, by the deck commander and the other operational crews. So one of the things they used to do to the new crews was what they called frag, which was usually a sophisticated practical joke, where they would get you out and put you in the airplane for some reason, that you had to do some kind of radio check or instrument check, and then everybody would leave. Another time we dismantled the deck commander's office and set it up out in the hangar. It was Ray Samay. And he came to work, and his entire desk and office, including the flag and all of his books, was sitting in the middle of the hangar. So the worst frag that they gave Maury and I was they didn't give us one.
So sort of like the simulator you were talking about.
I mean, we were waiting for the last day to the sky to fall, and it never did. So that was kind of ugly of them.
Yeah, and the anticipation, and you're just waiting, and then you become so nervous about what's going to happen. You're looking over your shoulder all the time.
So we're going to tell you at the end another little story about our first deployment at Kadena. That'll be coming up.
So as I mentioned earlier, 100 flight hours for the pilot before deployment. And in the simulator, you probably had over 200 hours of simulator time. So you can see it's pretty intensive as far as becoming routine, if you could call it that, with the procedures, as long as nothing's changing too rapidly. And one of the other bases we mentioned that we would routinely deploy to was RAF Mildenhall, north of London, northeast Anglia, I guess it was. And we went in the fall. Did we go in the fall?
Yes.
Our first one? Yeah. That was right after our deployment to Kadena. So they didn't frag us, but I wouldn't say fragged ourselves, but we had a little bit of excitement on our first deployment together. There's 6 weeks that Ed and I were there on our last sortie before we were scheduled to return to Beale Air Force Base.
We've kind of covered some of these as we've talked about here. For me personally, getting in the program was a lifelong achievement, and it was kind of the pinnacle as far as being a navigator in SAC to get to fly into this airplane. It was something that was only given to a select group of aviators, and I was very fortunate to get to fly in the airplane, particularly with Maury for almost 4 years. So this is something that Maury alluded to. We're going to talk to you a little bit about, which is some of the personal events. This was at the end of our first tour It was actually our final flight of our first tour.
We flew in through the DMZ in between North and South Korea, and there's a arm or a peninsula that sticks into the DMZ, which is Choktauri. Was that the name of the island?
I don't remember.
I don't either.
They don't know.
You're the navigator.
They don't know.
They don't know?
Just say it was it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
That's good. And we made several passes through the DMZ with no defensive or intercept type actions from the North Korean side of the DMZ, which could be unusual, not that unusual. Sometimes nothing was going on. But on that particular flight, the flights prior to that other crew members had been flying, and I think we may have even flown some, there had been a lot of activity from the North Koreans trying to lock onto the airplane, sometimes locking onto the airplane, sometimes spoofing the airplane that they're going to fire a missile. And it was being watched critically by our intel. We would brief not just us, but other flights that went before us. They would brief the activity after the flight at our post-flight briefing and tell them what instruments we saw. Mainly that was the backseater's job with regard to the interpretation of what the defensive equipment was getting and if they were turning on jammers against it and so forth. So there was quite a bit of attention at a different level than normal. And prior to that flight, the intel officer for the pre-flight portion of the briefing would brief about the SAM site that they suspected was there, and we asked what changed, what's the criteria for a SAM site, you know? Who decides if it's real or it's suspected? And this, I think he was first lieutenant, wasn't he? And he was smart first lieutenant. He said, that's above my pay grade. So who makes those decisions?
So the reason we wanted to tell you a little bit about this event is, guess who we're still dealing with?
Yeah.
And the thing that us aviators who flew in proximity to these people always worried about is their unpredictability. I mean, these guys just up and fired 3 SAMs at us in international airspace for no particular reason that we know of, other than they wanted to. So the depiction in the lower left is obviously a cartoon, but it's something like Maury probably saw. We found out after the fact that they had actually launched 3 SAMs, which was part of their protocol. One did not stage, the other one blew up on the launcher, but the third one got to our altitude, and maybe Maury will tell you what he saw.
Yeah, once Ed went through the normal procedures of picking up the radar sweeping or painting our airplane and then going to a narrower lock-on where it's high frequency pulsing on the aircraft, that they are concentrating on us and have a good lock-on, and then it goes into a missile launch that he can detect, and they talk to the missile to guide it. And at that point, the sophistication of our aircraft was we could tell if the missile responded or answered the guidance signals. And Ed was able to do that, and so he's jamming the aircraft, and I looked over the nose of the aircraft, and that's pretty similar to what I saw was the contrail, the exhaust initially, and the contrail of the rocket coming up, the SA-2 coming up at us. And I relayed that to Ed.
My voice got a little higher pitch.
Yeah. And he was right on top of it, thinking ahead, as he said, well, let's accelerate and turn away, which is what we did. I saw it go by off the right side, and I saw the warhead explode, and it was, it's hard to judge distance at altitude, and I think I estimated 1.5 miles, 2 miles, and I saw the explosion, and so it was a real thing.
Both Maury and I had seen him in Vietnam. This was most of the people didn't know the SAM was going to go that high. And in fact, when we got back and told some of the intel guys, he's going, well, that version doesn't go that high. And I said, I think we have an update for you. Because it went off slightly above us. But the one thing it did, and the ECM system on the airplane was made by Northrop Grumman at the time, God love them, it used a very sophisticated radar jamming technique where it displaced the signal that the SAM radar was deceiving to a higher gain signal off of your airplane. And the SAM would go for the higher gain signal and not the actual target. So it worked beautifully. And as we were leaving the area, one of the things you did was you had to keep in contact with Mother back home, so you were supposed to give a operational report on the HF radio. And we turned out of the area and both collected our thoughts as we headed back toward the Kadena. We didn't talk for a while. And I'm sitting back there going through my comm flimsy, and Maury said, "Are you going to give a radio report?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking about it." And I said, "I don't think we're going to give one." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I don't have anything that fits this situation." It was a peacetime bag for comm flimsy, and if we'd had a wartime bag, you might have had something in there about an incident of being fired on, but we didn't have anything. And needless to say, we kept them worrying back at Kadena. And after we landed, usually the commander would meet you. He'd run up the ladder. And our commander at the time was Colonel Randy Herzog. Jack remembers him. He was an interesting character, smoked a pipe. And he runs up the ladder and says, "All right, McKim, the beer's on you, no ops normal report." And I told him, I said, "Sir, we had a situation. We probably need to go in your office and talk about it." And he kept bugging me, and he wanted to know, "Well, what happened? Why didn't you give me a radio report?" And I told him, finally, I said, "We were fired on by a SA-2 missile." And he said, "In my office," right away. So after they got in there, we hadn't even gotten out of our pressure chutes yet, and we were sitting in there with the commander, and the squadron comm guy comes in and opens up this giant book and showed it to Colonel Herzog, and he said, "You have to call the Pentagon." Yeah. Speaking to Colonel Herzog. So if any of you guys have ever conducted military priority radio traffic, you know there's a hierarchy, and he was trying to get out on flash, and he couldn't. So there was only one other, that was flash override, which meant we were at nuclear war. Hopefully he wasn't there, but Colonel Herzog, he had a nice experience, as we did as well.
Yeah. That sort of wraps up this portion of the presentation, and we'd like to open it up for questions. And go ahead. This young lady right here.
The question was, we're flying fast and high. How did you make any ground references or anything? Well, we really didn't. I, as a backseater, had an optical view sight, but we navigated the aircraft by an inertial system which was coupled to an astro tracker. This was before GPS, remember? So that's how we navigated, and you could take a fix with the radar after it came on, but you couldn't depend on the radar for navigation because it was a reconnaissance type radar and it didn't give you ground mapping. Well, the sensors did that. As crew members, we didn't do that kind of visual reconnaissance.
The sensors, yeah, there was a follow-on question with, we didn't do any actual ground reconnaissance, but as Ed was saying, the sensors did. They could pick all that up.
So we had radar in the nose, and we had high-definition cameras in what we call the chines along the side of the aircraft.
And in the nose, we could also install what was called an optical bar camera besides the radar.
Which is still flying on the U-2, believe it or not. That camera is still flying.
He asked if I had, as a pilot, if I had any delta wing time, like the F-102 or the F-106 before I got into the SR-71 program. And I did not. When I flew F-4s out of Japan, well, I flew F-4s in Vietnam in '67. I spent 3 years in Japan after that flying F-4s. So that was January of '68 when they stole the Pueblo, and we deployed a lot of other aircraft over to South Korea. And as things calmed down, we did what fighter pilots do when we're out training, and sometimes we would jump other aircraft, and we had a lot of other aircraft there. We had F-105s, F-4s, F-106s. I'm trying to think what else, if they were still flying some F-100s there. I don't remember that, but I got jumped by some F-106s sometimes, and those guys were Air Defense Command, and they didn't wear G-suits. I don't think they wore G-suits when they were in South Korea either. And I discovered if he got behind me, if I could sustain about 5 Gs, he couldn't stay behind me and follow me. Because I had a G-suit. I didn't black out. The question is the fastest I ever went in the SR-71, and on the Mach meter, I'd say it was about 3.3 Mach, which is about maybe a little over 2,200 miles per hour. You have no sensation of speed. It's just like flying in a commercial airliner. Nothing's going by.
You don't have any cloud references.
Yeah,
I mean,
nothing.
you're above all the clouds, so
Yeah.
you don't really have any sensation of how fast you're going.
In the front seat, we had a mileage meter, or whatever you want to call it, just like on your car, an odometer that counts off tenths of a mile. And ours was counting off miles. And it went about as fast as the tenth of a mile on yours. If you're doing about 60 or 70 miles an hour, you know, that's moving at a pretty good clip. That's how the mile one was clicking off.
One of the most impressive things I have to admit I ever saw in the airplane was occasionally, it was once a year or so, we had 4 airplanes deployed, 2 to Kadena and 2 to Mildenhall. And during some time during that year, we would change out the aircraft and bring it back to Palmdale, where they were retrofitted and overhauled. So if you were lucky enough, you got to fly the airplane home instead of making the 20-hour tanker ride, you get home in about 3 hours, right? So when you did that, we normally would try to fly an operational mission. If we were coming east toward Alaska, we'd fly along Kamchatka Peninsula there. And the one thing we used to try to do was coordinate where the other airplane was. We knew where he was, we knew where we were. But you could tune in the air-to-air TAC-in and watch a Mach 6 closure. Now, that was impressive. That was impressive.
The question is, in today's world, is there any advantage a aircraft has over a satellite with regard to monitoring what's going on? And my personal opinion is yes. I feel that an airplane not only can be used more judiciously with regard to timing, and with regard to a satellite, you have to wait till it's back in that orbit. They can maneuver satellites. Its maneuverability is limited to a degree. So an aircraft is more responsive in a critical situation. And if nothing else, with the SR-71, you know, it was the sound of freedom. We could go right over and boom somebody, and they couldn't touch that airplane at the time of its, you know, life when it was flying those things.
Remember, the satellite was predictable in its orbit.
Question was, after we air refueled, he wanted to know about available thrust to climb to speed and altitude, and he had read something about what was called a dipsy doodle maneuver, and that's what it was called. What we would do, we would come off the tanker, we'd go into afterburner, and we would start a climb at 0.9 Mach. Normally we disconnected at about 25,000 feet off the tanker, and we'd start a climb to about 30,000 feet. And as we were approaching 30,000 feet, we'd go max afterburner, and we'd push the aircraft over, sort of a parabolic arc type thing. And that was to get through what's called the transonic range. Just a minute.
It is an airport.
But that was where there was the most drag, was in the transonic range. And by pointing the nose down and getting the 1 G force of gravity with you, you would get through it quicker as you accelerated through the Mach. And then once you went through Mach 1, you would start back pressure on the stick, and you would start a climb as you were accelerating, and we'd transition to keys, which is knots equivalent airspeed. There was a readout, and we'd get 450 keys, and we'd start climbing at 450 keys and the aircraft would continue to accelerate. The question was, what's replaced the SR-71 and can you talk about it? And Ed just said nothing. As far as the manned aircraft, I know of nothing also.
So back to this gentleman asked about satellites versus the aircraft. A quick story, which is what most of you guys probably came to listen to anyway. We were mission planning one day and finished up, and the wing commander came in, and the wing commander never came to the squadron unless he's going to chew somebody out, right? So he shows up and said, "You guys need to go over to the vault, and there's somebody over there you're supposed to meet." So we didn't know what was going on. So we went over there and we met two guys in black suits with black ties, and they had credentials and everything. I didn't know who they were. He said, "You guys be on time tomorrow." And he said, "Sir, we're always on time." And he said, "Be on time tomorrow at your target." Well, we were flying around Cuba the next day. Long story short was, we didn't have any sensors on the airplane. When we got out there, we're trying to figure out what the heck's going on, right? What had happened was that Mr. Castro was having a change of command ceremony at our time over target, and we nailed it just about the time he transferred the flag. We gave him a big sonic boom just to kind of say hello. The question was about getting lost and what did you use for backup navigation. In the early days, before we made some modifications to the aircraft navigation system, you got to remember, if any airplane you fly, it's all by DR, right? Time and heading, whatever airplane you're flying, it didn't matter. If you're flying at 100 knots or 2,000 knots, usually one of the things you always had to do was wherever you were, you would have a turn to direction. Where do I turn to get out of trouble and then figure out what the heck's going wrong? But what had happened, the inertial system was pretty reliable, but in the latter part of the program, we put in a backup F-16 standalone inertial, and that thing just ran free inertial. It only had like a ½ mile drift rate an hour, and you just left that alone, and that was your backup navigation if you had a problem. The question was about running the navigation system and looking at the program data point, or the program turn points that were in the computer. That was done by an old paper tape in the old days that they punched out on a computer. That tape was sent out and read into the airplane, and it was your job as the, what do we call the backup crew? The
backup crew?
No, the guys who did the pre-flight and everything. Yeah. The other crew. Anyway, we had a backup crew. We had a backup crew that would pre-flight the airplane for you. They'd be with you out there if you had a problem. We're in the pressure suit. These guys were in flight suits. It was also part of their job to read out all of these points and confirm their proper coordinates.
When we did a test run for 10 hours down at Eglin Air Force Base, they came back within 10 hours of flying with the nav system 20 feet off of the runway. So it was pretty accurate.
I don't know if it was that good, but it was pretty darn accurate. See, it was tied to an astrotracker, as I mentioned, and that would keep the inertial system, what we call bounded, by a certain amount of drift air.
But before we do another question, since we've been talking about the navigational stuff, I just read an article here a week or so ago, and it was about the SR-71 astro-inertial navigation system. And basically, what it's telling you is an inertial system is gyroscopic that drifts, gyros can drift. And the astro portion of it is tracking the stars. Yes. And you had to feed in the information of what hemisphere you were in, the Julian date, the time of the year, and all this kind of stuff. So there were star patterns, and it knew what stars to look for. And then it could track up to 3 stars. It had a catalog of, I don't know how many, 150, 200 stars that it could look at. Anyhow, the astro part of it, what it did was it kept the gyros from drifting. It would update them so that they wouldn't drift. Now, I told you all that in this article. The gist of the article was that part of a new defense system is being able to jam navigational systems that we have in different weaponry. Missiles, aircraft, I'm trying to think what else, ships. And it said that this article was talking about how the SR-71, this older system, you cannot jam an astro tracker. You can't jam the gyro that's spinning. And they were looking at some method of updating these new devices so that they were less vulnerable. And they said they're considering some sort of astro tracking. Had you read that?
I did.
Yeah.
If any of you are fortunate enough recently to go to the Smithsonian, they're on the mall in Washington, they have a navigation display area, if you will, and there's one of the astro tracker units in there on display. The question was, is the astro tracker like the B-58?
Yeah.
I don't remember the B-58 had an astro tracker. It did? I stand corrected, I didn't fly it. It was just a later version as gyros got better. The Kalman filter, which is, some of you guys may be familiar with that mathematical technique of how it determined error, got better. And the SR at any one time, we figured it out later. I got to work at the Skunk Works on the program and we looked at it. We figured at any one time, even early on, it was within about 1,000 feet of where it should have been, which is darn good for that era of navigation. The
question was, did we have any incidences in the airplane where we had, malfunctions, specifically, he said, with the engine. And I don't know if anybody saw, there's a new Smithsonian release that I did. It wasn't with Ed, this was with, this was in 1974, I think, with Don Bullock. And we were at Kadena Air Base, and we had a test top, a functional check flight that came up. The aircraft needed a double engine change, and as best as I recall, I don't know if you were around there, Gene? Yeah. Yeah. You talking about? Yeah. Yeah. What it was the Pratt & Whitney had sent over some spare air engines, and we had one spare, I believe, on station. And when they went to do the double engine change, these spares that had just arrived hadn't had time to do all the inspections that they do on them, and they put the one that was already there that our maintenance people had inspected from Pratt, that came from Pratt & Whitney, and the other one our maintenance people hadn't had the time to go through the whole thing, but they said, we'll stick it in there anyhow. And so we went up on this test top, and Don Bullock and myself. And part of the test stop was to go as high and as fast as it would go and then back off. And when we went to back off, we had what was called an aerodynamic disturbance or an unstart. And that's when the nacelle or the engine hiccups, so to speak, like a backfire. And the way the system worked, as the aircraft went supersonic, the engine did less and less of the thrust. You had a ramjet effect, and the cone in the front of that nacelle would retract back into the nacelle about 26 inches. And it was this was an analog system. They hadn't gone to DAFIX yet. I don't know how much difference it would have made. But if you want to say it was a dumb system, the only way it knew to fix the system was to drive the reason the system malfunctioned, was there were sensors inside the nacelle where the shock wave should be, and they were not sensing it was in the proper position. So the dumb system would kick the spike forward to kick the shock wave out and then recapture it. And you could lose approximately 80% of your thrust when it did that. So the airplane wanted to turn sideways. And they, above Mach 2.1, they what they call cross-tied the inlets so that if one side let go, the other side would let go, so you had more controllability. So the right side, which I didn't know which engine was in which engine, or which nacelle, the right side was the engine that they had not inspected. And it unstarted, and the fire light came on shortly after it unstarted. So I was relaying to the back seater. We had an unstart and a fire light, and I looked in the periscope to look behind me, and I said, we have smoke. And his comment was, we're at 78,000 feet, we're too high for contrails. And we start going through the fire checklist, and as we're going through the fire checklist, the aircraft were initiating a supersonic descent, And from flight tests, they tell us that the aircraft can be extremely violent in a supersonic descent with pitch, yaw, and roll. And we're really bouncing around as we're starting down and going through the engine shutdown, the fire light's still on, it finally goes out, and as about the time it goes out, the left generator trips off the line, and we start to lose cabin pressurization. The left engine, due to the extreme pitch, yaw, and roll, had flamed out from starvation, air starvation. And the backseater, when all this was going on, he's a great big guy. He's about 6'4", and he tried to steady himself in the back seat, and he put his hands down on the side rails here where the comm switches were, and he turned off the comm unknowingly between he and I. So we're not talking to each other, and he's not reading any more checklists to me. And as my pressure suit starts to inflate, you're like the Michelin tire guy, you know, it'll come up over your head. There's a tie-down strap. I pull the strap down, and I realize the engine's not running. I move the left throttle, and there's no response. So I jammed it into afterburner, and it lit right off. I got the nose pointed pretty steep dive. We were probably coming down now to about 45 or 50 degrees. And I'm looking, all I see in front of me is ocean, and we're going through probably about, just guessing, somewhere in the 60,000 foot range, and I know I have a lot of area to drop, but we're dropping like a rock, and I'm thinking if I don't get this thing started, we're bailing out over the water here. And the thought I'm having is, how long will it take them to find us? That's the thought I'm having. But it lit off, and just about the time it lit off, I put the generator back on, pressurization's coming back, and the backseater figured out what he had done, and he's back on the air, and he's a really good guy, good navigator, and smart gentleman. And he says, "Where are you in the checklist?" And I said, "What happened to you?" And he said, "I'll tell you later."
So in other words, it was just like a simulator.
Yeah.
So we put that scenario in the training profile. Question is, where is Kadena? It's on the island of, southern part of the island of Okinawa?
It's an air base, military base.
Military air base?
Yes.
Sir? Okay. Yeah. Oh, we still have active duty military there today. We're not as welcome as we once were, but we're still there.
The question is, could you jump out or bail out of a supersonic aircraft, the SR-71? The SR-71 ejection system was considered what they call a 0-0 system. You could bail out standing still, sitting on the ramp, or you could bail out at max altitude and max speed. And it was would be a successful system. And at the highest altitude and speed, there's actually less dynamic forces on the body because the molecules are further apart, the air molecules. And the worst range to bail out in the SR-71 was probably between 40 and 60,000 feet, depending on how fast you're going, if you're supersonic. Yeah.
The first shuttle mission.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Gene.
Didn't you guys save 960 coming in, correct?
Yeah, that's right. The aircraft with the single engine we brought back, Don and I were, how Ed had mentioned how the new guys and you're still in training on your first tour and everything. I think this was actually might have been the second tour for Don Bullock and I. And we were still considered new guys. And so when we recovered the aircraft and we were subsonic and we were flying and we were headed back to Kadena on this test flight, and we called in and told them we had a single engine. They were a little skeptical and didn't know what had happened. And we didn't do a lot of radio discussion, but we told them we had had an engine blow up. So anyhow, when we landed and taxied in, normally we would go taxi into the hangar, but they stopped us outside the hangar. And I like this because Frazier was the senior chief maintenance, Chief Frazier, at Kadena, and I love this gentleman. He reminded me of a World War II character when I was growing up. You'd see in the movies. He was bald-headed, had a cigar stuck in his mouth. I never saw him smoking it, but there was always a cigar stuck in his mouth, and he had forearms like Popeye or somebody. And he was hell on wheels, but they all respected him. I mean, he was a good gentleman. And I see him coming under the airplane. He's the first person I see going under that airplane. And we're getting out of the airplane, and I'm coming down the ladder. And this sort of describes the devotion that everybody had to this program. Because the first thing out of the chief, I was a captain at the time, he comes up to me and he says, "Captain, what the hell did you do to my airplane? There's holes in it."
Did you save the airplane, receive a Collier trophy?
No, we didn't receive a trophy. We got a well done award.
Someone had asked about the ejection system. It was built by Lockheed. And if some of you may remember, it was on board the first space shuttle flight with Crippen and Young. And they soon discovered that there was only a very minimal window during the ascent of the shuttle as it accelerated that you could actually get out alive. But the seats were in the first shuttle launch.
The same seats.
Same seats.
The question is, did we ever fly any of the early D-21 drone sorties? And if not, could we tell why it was unsuccessful? Well, there was about 3 to 4 generations of pilots and navigators in the SR-71, and the drone program was more on the CIA side, the A-12, although they used the SR-71. But what I was going to say was that that was more of a first generation. When I came in 73, I guess I would say I was in the second generation of crew members coming into the program. And Ed was after that, so he was like in the third. So no, we didn't. And unsuccessfulness, I'll let Ed take that.
Sure. When I was in the program, I came in 80. That program was still being flown in the Air Force. It was so classified, we didn't even know about it as crew members. So that's how close they held what was going on. And the very basic reason for its failure was it just didn't have a good enough inertial system to navigate that vehicle to the desired turn points and get it to come back. It was a device decades ahead of its time based on what we're doing now with remote aircraft and drones. But the basic reason was the inertial state of the art at that time was just not good enough.
The question was about the SR flying over Vietnam in 63 to 68. That was the question, sir? Whether it was the A-12 or the SR-71. Honestly, I can't tell you, but I can make the statement that, as I mentioned, I was in Vietnam in 67 and then went to Japan right after that. So I was in Japan in 68 flying out of Korea. We'd go to Korea, TDY. And over Vietnam, before I left Vietnam in 67, late 67, I thought I spotted a high altitude target go past me one time. So whether it was an A-12 or an SR-71, I don't know.
The A-12 originally flew in Vietnam, as you described. Later on, it was transitioned to the SR-71 as the A-12 was phased out. A very interesting story I just read recently dealt with I had a couple friends in the Hanoi Hilton. Well, they had a very secret mission, and the way they communicated with those guys, you may have learned something about the tap code and how they were communicating outside. When they elected to try to make a raid on the Hanoi Hilton, the code signal for the go-ahead was 2 SRs that overflew Hanoi about 30 seconds apart, and they sonic boomed them. And the guys in the POW camp knew that the attempted raid was on by that signal.
The question was, what was the big difference between Mach 2.8 and 3.0 in the aircraft? And it was the heat. The heat that gets generated exponentially increases as you go faster. And that the heat's for everything, for all the systems, the engines, and so forth. When I was in the first tour in the SR-71 from 73 to 78, we were still overflying South Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And, well, the war was still going on when it was right towards the end of the war, actually, I guess, when I got in it. But I just remember coming in over Hanoi one time, and we accelerated because we were getting def signals. And the pilots had a compressor inlet temperature gauge called a CIT, compressor inlet temperature, and it was limited for speed for our Mach 3, but it was limited on temperature was the big limitation for the engine. And as I recall, it just pops in my head like 427 degrees centigrade. That was it. And I remember turning in over Hanoi one time, and we got SAM's signals or DEF signals or whatever. I pushed it, the power up, and I was looking outside, looking for anything coming up at us. And I looked back in, and I think I'd passed 427, and I thought, oh my gosh. So when we landed, at maintenance debrief, I brought that up to the crew chief as we went around the table, and he said, I know your book says 427. I don't remember what his is. His is higher. Yeah, they said it's not an inspection. Ours goes higher. You don't trust us. The question is, with the success of the program and what it was capable of doing, why did they retire it? And honest personal opinion with some fact, politics and money.
That was the reason right there. One of the other significant reasons is the satellite mafia got to the chief of staff of the Air Force and told him they could do this job for a hell of a lot cheaper. And depending on how you cook the numbers, you could make it look cheaper. There was always a big argument, SR against the U-2, about the cost. Cost per flying hour, cost per mile, we even figured it out a number of ways, but they never entered the equation about the SR got there and got back before the U-2 ever got there. That was somehow lost in translation as part of the arguments. But the real reason was we didn't have a chief of staff of the Air Force who wanted the airplane. He didn't understand the airplane. He didn't understand what it did and what its capabilities were. So they made a reason for budgetary reasons. That was their excuse for getting rid of it, and as you recall, President Clinton line item vetoed it, first time ever, and that's how it was taken out of the budget.
Question is, how many aircraft were made? Between the A-12 program and the SR-71, it was what, 32, 33?
32.
32. The question is, could I talk about the controllability between the SR-71 and the U? How close were you to V-stall on the SR-71 compared to the U-2? And what he's getting at is when the U-2 was cruising, they had a very narrow speed range with regard to getting into a stall. I don't know that much about the U-2, so you know, comparability, I know that we had a larger stall margin, but and I don't know the stall characteristics of the U-2. Where with the SR-71, it was a delta wing aircraft. It didn't have a classic wing rock and buffet with regard to a stall. Oh, the controllability at high Mach was, it's like sitting in your car doing 60 miles an hour in no traffic. And I hope you have good tires, though.
One of the unique features on the SR from the pilot's perspective, it had a stick shaker, and it would just shake the stick when you would get into the onset of high angle of attack. And if you didn't unload, it would unload for you. And you weren't going to defeat 3,000 PSI. So he always had to be cognizant of where he was on the angle of attack curve, no matter how fast he was flying.
The question was, how many flight hours and how many missions do we each have in the SR-71? Flight hours, I ended up with, I claim the most operational hours because I have 1,092 hours. There are other pilots that had more than that, but all of them got the time from leaving Beale and being in flight test and flying flight test and not operational sorties. All of mine were in the operational end of it. Ed?
I only ended up with about 600 hours. That's a lot of miles, so. So that old adage about is it your age or how many miles you got on you, that was a good question, you know. The other thing that happened is when you'd reach different milestones as far as hours in the aircraft, Lockheed provided you pins, so you got an initial pin for your first Mach 3 flight. Then you got subsequent pins at 300 and 600. Was it 900?
900.
And then 1,000 or something? So those were very unique pins. If you ever get a chance to, somebody's got one of those. He has, I don't have one. I got two, but.
The question was that he had read that each aircraft has its own personality and quirks, and that's true. They were all slightly different. Even though it's a manufactured aircraft, I don't know, in the process of manufacturing it, there was just put together with some different personalities, and that's the way the airplanes work. This is my own impression of how I feel with regard to having flown that aircraft and the hours I had in it. You read about in the early days of aviation and some of these pilots that went through it, and they had the feel or the could fly by the seat of their pants type thing, and they could more or less really talk to the airplane, so to speak. I don't know that I ever felt that way flying the F-4, but in the SR-71, I felt more in tune with the aircraft, and I don't know if some of it was just the intense training that you had gone through, and your scan, or you're watching everything all the time, all the different instruments, even though you're looking outside, you're looking inside and concentrating. And it was almost sometimes I could sense that my fuel's getting out of balance, and I'd check the gauge, and sure enough, so I was getting a feel for that, so to speak. And I don't know if it's just possibly subconsciously your mind has a little timer, and you knew that an hour and a half into the supersonic leg, you're going to be coming down, and the fuel needs to be balanced better.
One of the other things you asked about that was, I was lucky enough to be a system engineer at the Skunk Works after I flew the airplane for a while. And usually on modern aircraft, one of the requirements you run into is interchangeability of panels. They like to do that. This panel will fit this aircraft and that aircraft. But you couldn't do that on the SR. They were all unique. They were all slightly different size. They had different drill holes. So each aircraft from that perspective was an individual aircraft. You couldn't interchange panels.
I think I understand the question. The question was, this is my sister. My older sister.
Careful.
So her question was about how did you know they were different until you got in it? Was that the question? You didn't until you'd flown it a few times. And having had 2 tours in the SR-71, I flew a lot of the different tail numbers. So consequently, I could relate one tail number to another tail number that I had previously flown, and knew that some handled and felt different than the others. Was that the answer? You're welcome. My wife is here also, as you know. She was introduced. So these are leading questions for the audience. And I know what she's alluding to. The question is, did you ever fly over commercial airports? That was the question from my wife. Yes. Well, and the rest of the question, or the rest of the answer is, I think it was the 1982 or 83 Toronto Air Show. I was a participant, and we took an SR-71 there, and it was 3 crew members went. 1 crew flew it in, 1 crew flew the second day air show, and the 3rd crew, which was myself, flew just a couple of flybys at the 3rd day of the air show, and then actually flew the aircraft back to Beale Air Force Base. And the Toronto Air Show is over the, what is it, Labor Day weekend? Is it the Labor Day weekend in September? What's the first? It's Monday. Yeah, that's when they always have it. And and it's a holiday weekend. So when I came back into the Sacramento area, and I was descending down to land at Beale, and we had a lot of fuel, and we had to work on the holiday. And I said, I asked the backseater, I said, you want to make an approach at Sac Metro? And he said, can we do that? And I said, why not?
You can do anything once.
Yeah, exactly. So I, on approach control, when we got over to approach control, I asked if Sac Metro was available for a an approach, and they said they switched us over to SAC Metro, and they cleared us for an approach. So as we were coming down final, and we had configured the airplane with the gear down, and we're about 2 miles out on final, I asked the controller, they switched us over to tower, and I asked the tower, I said, would you like a flyby down the runway or down the ramp? And the guy said, down the ramp. And I said, okay. I sucked the gear up and I pushed the power up, and we started heading towards the ramp, towards the tower. And as we were approaching it, I rolled the plane up away from the tower and lit the afterburners. And we went around and made a pass, and the tower controller said, beautiful, beautiful, come back and do another one. And I said, I better not, I'm going to go to Beale. So we went back to Beale and we landed, and as I mentioned, holiday weekend, and Colonel Lonnie Liss was he was the DO. He was the director of flight operations, the DO. Sorry?
Straight Lonnie.
Straight Lonnie, yeah. Anyhow, so he met us when we pulled in the hangar after we landed. As I mentioned, that was the normal procedure. And I thought, well, that's nice that he came out. As I came down the ladder from the aircraft, he looked at me, he said, Maury, and I said, yes, sir. He said, do we have any regulations that say we can't make approaches at Sacramento Airport? I said, no, sir. I want one on my desk at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Now, there's a continuation to this story. I retired in '87 and flew with United Airlines. When I had previously flown for United. I had a break in service. When I went back to United, I was a 760 co-pilot, Boeing 767 co-pilot. And one of my, that first year in '87, I think it was either the fall of '87 or the winter of '88, right after the new year, I was flying a 767 from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And an air traffic controller wanted to know if they could ride in the cockpit. And the captain of the plane signed it off. They have that privilege, or if they want to do that. And the aircraft, normally when they do that, if there's an empty seat somewhere, the captain will ask one of the flight attendants to stick him in an empty seat in the back of the plane. The plane was full. So this young lady was the air traffic controller. She came in. She's quite an attractive young lady. And the captain I was flying with was, I don't know if he was married or not, but I know he was a big flirt. I hadn't flown with him before. So I was flying. It was my leg from D.C. to San Francisco. You would trade off flying legs in the airlines. And we're flying, and he's just talking to her halfway across the country. And at some point, he asked her how long she'd worked at San Francisco Airport, and she hadn't been there that long. She said, I used to work SAC Metro. So this is, I think it was 1988. And I looked over my shoulder at this young lady, and I said, were you working SAC Metro in 1982 or whatever it was, 82 or 83? And she looked at me, and she said, yeah, I was. Why do you ask? And I said, were you working tower when the SR-71 buzzed it? And she said, oh, yeah, I was. How did you know that? And I told her it was me, and she started laughing, and she said, you scared the hell out of people. She said there were people in the terminal that dived to the ground. They thought the airplane was going to hit the terminal.
Good job.
When did I learn to fly or start flying? Was when I joined the military. I had not flown prior to that.
Yeah, same for me. Learned in the military. The question was, do we need a specialized runway?
Or airport.
Or airport? The answer was not really if we had an adequate runway length. The aircraft had a certain specified minimum runway length, and you also had to consider that runway length in the case of an abort. So you didn't want to sell yourself short on runway length. Remember, what is it, the three most worst things? Air above you, the runway behind you, and something else, I don't know.
And the question was, how long could you fly the aircraft before you were just physically exhausted? And you know, your adrenaline was really going all the time. Really, and it was amazing that, you know, the longest mission I think I flew was a little over 7 hours. How about you?
I flew one from the U.S. over to Europe. We were on a reconnaissance mission. That mission was about 11 hours. So that meant you were in the suit about 14, and that was a lot. That was as much as I wanted.
But what I was going to say to that was the one I flew that was a little over 7 hours was amazingly, the time seemed to go by so fast, I couldn't believe it. Well, two quick questions, and you pointed to somebody else. I'll take this gentleman. He wanted to know how many refuelings, and it just depended on the mission and the sortie.
Tab
And how much TEB you had, and also the nitrogen for inerting the tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had these flasks that contained liquid nitrogen, and it would evolve into a gaseous state to keep a head pressure on the fuel tanks and also protect them from igniting from heat.
The TEB was a chemical that would ignite the afterburner. The afterburner would not ignite like a modern-day fighter on its own with a glow plug or whatever. So you had to use a chemical ignition system to light the afterburner, and there were a limited quantity of that material on board the aircraft.
Oh, my refueling's longest flight? I have to think about it. We refueled right after we took off out of Beale. We refueled off the Hudson Bay. We refueled off of Norway. We came out of Murmansk and we took a token offload. I guess 4 or 5 was probably the most refuelings I ever did.
4 on that 11-hour mission that I was on. One of the great things, if you would take off from Beale, particularly if you were going to the det, just kind of a side story, you could take off in the dark. After about 30 minutes, you could capture the sun. Sunrise would come up again. That was pretty cool. Because you're flying faster than the sun was traveling around, the Earth was traveling.
Question was, what was the weather minimums, and did we use GCA ground-controlled approach systems? Yeah, we did use GCA. The ILS was extremely accurate with regard to the astro-inertial, and you could monitor it, right? Yeah. And how accurate it was. So the weather minimums was depending on if it was an operational mission or not. I did not fly this mission, but I launched a mission, an operational sortie out of Beale, actually, and the weather was what they call below minimums, 0 for departure. And we passed that on to the execution authority, which was coming from the Pentagon, and they came back and said, pilot's choice. And he took off.
So once you got the aircraft subsonic, it was a regular aircraft, quite frankly. And of course, you had to abide by all the FAA rules and regulations and standard approach plate procedures for minimums and that kind of thing.
The question is, how long does in-flight refueling take? The actual offload is not much more than, what, 15 minutes?
About 20 minutes max.
15, 20 minutes max for the offload. But we would often just hang in position because the navigator or the RSO would plan the point of disconnect so that we were pointed in the right direction at the right point to just drop off, light the burners, and go straight. So sometimes you'd be on the boom for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. The question was because of heat expansion as the aircraft heated up that the airframe actually grew in length, and that is true. If you go to the Smithsonian or someplace or out to the Palmdale to the air park out there, Blackbird Air Park, you see gaps in where the leading edge comes in to the chine, and the gaps actually expanded and came together.
One of the other historical things which a lot of people find anecdotal about the airplane is it leaked a lot of gas on the ground, and the crew chiefs and the other guys would wear slickers and boots because that JP7 would eat the soles off your shoes. But the tanks were steel on the inside, and they had sealant joints that would deteriorate over a period of time. It wasn't anything dangerous. It just meant that the aircraft would leak fuel. But once you got to altitude and the heat would start penetrating the aircraft, those tanks would expand and it would seal off and they didn't leak. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.